Have you ever seen arrogance crumble in a single moment that rewrites someone's entire world? Picture this. An elderly woman, dressed in a simple floral dress, steps into the dazzling Tiffany & Co. on Fifth Avenue, only to be mocked and humiliated by a smug salesman who thinks she's too poor to belong. She's calm, unshaken, until Keanu Reeves roars in on his motorcycle, calls her mom, and turns the tables in a way no one saw coming. He doesn't just defend her, he unveils a lesson so profound it leaves the store and the salesman forever changed. Where are you watching from right now? Your kitchen, your couch, and what state are you in? Drop it in the comments. If this hooks you, hit like and subscribe, because what unfolds next is beyond anything you'd predict. Let's get into it. It was a crisp afternoon on March 2025 when Patricia Taylor, a 81-year-old woman with silver hair and a modest floral dress, walked into Tiffany & Co. on Fifth Avenue, New York. The store was a fortress of luxury, its name alone a symbol of wealth and prestige. Patricia pushed through the heavy glass door, her steps slow but deliberate. She wasn't there to gawk or daydream, she had a purpose. Her eyes landed on a diamond necklace behind the counter, its sparkle catching her attention. She paused, taking it in, then moved forward with quiet confidence. Charles Bennett, a senior salesman in his mid-30s, clocked her the second she stepped in. Dressed in a tailored suit that screamed money, he leaned against the counter, his Rolex glinting as he adjusted his cufflinks. To him, Patricia didn't belong. Her simple dress and worn shoes painted a picture he'd seen before. Someone out of their depth, wasting his time. He shot a glance at Lydia, his colleague, a sharp-eyed woman polishing a display case nearby. Another old dreamer, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Lydia to smirk and nod in agreement. Charles straightened up, brushing imaginary lint off his jacket. He'd dealt with her type before, people who wandered in, touched things they couldn't afford, and left empty-handed. Not today, not on his watch. Patricia didn't catch the exchange. She approached the counter, her voice soft but steady. "Excuse me, could I see that diamond necklace over there?" She pointed to the piece that had caught her eye, a delicate chain with a single flawless stone dangling from it. Her tone was polite, almost curious, like she was asking about the weather. But to Charles it was a challenge. He raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That one?" he said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "You sure about that, ma'am?" He didn't wait for her to answer. He crossed his arms, sizing her up like she was a knockoff handbag he'd spotted from a mile away. Patricia nodded, unfazed. "Yes, please, I'd like to take a closer look." Her calm demeanor only seemed to irritate Charles more. He let out a short, dry laugh, loud enough to turn a few heads in the store. "All right then," he said, reaching for the necklace with exaggerated care as if handing it over was a chore he barely tolerated. He placed it on the velvet pad in front of her, but his posture screamed impatience. Arms crossed again, one foot tapping lightly against the polished floor. "Just so you know, that's a $50,000 piece, not exactly pocket change." Patricia didn't flinch. She picked up the necklace gently, her fingers tracing the chain with a kind of reverence Charles couldn't, or wouldn't, understand. "It's beautiful," she said simply, her eyes fixed on the diamond. "The craftsmanship is impressive." Charles snorted, barely hiding his disdain. "Yeah, well, impressive doesn't come cheap. That's real diamond, not some department store trinket." He leaned forward slightly, his tone sharpening. "Look, ma'am, let's not kid ourselves. This isn't the kind of thing you just take a closer look at unless you've got the cash to back it up." Lydia, still hovering nearby, stifled a laugh, pretending to adjust a ring in the display case. A couple of well-dressed customers glanced over, their curiosity piqued by the tension starting to simmer. Patricia set the necklace down carefully, meeting Charles's gaze with a steady look of her own. "I've always appreciated fine jewelry," she said, her voice still even. "I'd just like to see how it feels." Charles rolled his eyes, not even bothering to mask it this time. "Oh, I bet you would," he snapped, his patience fraying. "But this isn't a playground. We've got real clients here, people who don't waste my time pretending they belong." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. A few more heads turned, the murmur of the store dipping into an awkward quiet. Patricia didn't react, not with anger, not with embarrassment. She just stood there, her hands folded in front of her, as if she hadn't heard the insult at all. But Charles wasn't done. He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to keep it between them. "Listen, lady, why don't you save us both the trouble and head out? There's a thrift store down the street that's more your speed." He smirked, glancing at Lydia for approval. She nodded subtly, egging him on. Patricia tilted her head slightly, like she was considering his words. Then she smiled, a small, almost amused smile that threw Charles off for a split second. "I'll think about it," she said, her tone as calm as ever. But something in her eyes shifted, a flicker of something deeper, something Charles couldn't place. He brushed it off, turning away with a dismissive wave. "Good, don't take too long." He figured that was the end of it. He was wrong. Charles smirked, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of Tiffany & Co. like a blade. "You sure about that, ma'am? That necklace is worth more than your whole house, assuming you even have one." He leaned against the counter, arms still crossed, his tone thick with mockery. Patricia offered a polite smile, the kind you'd give a rude stranger on the street, but it didn't soften Charles one bit. If anything, it fueled him. Her calm refusal to back down was like a match to his already short fuse. He straightened up, his fake smile vanishing as he raised his voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. "Look, this isn't a place for dreamers. You need to leave, now, before I call security and have you escorted out." The words landed hard, echoing off the polished walls. A few customers froze mid-conversation, their eyes darting toward the scene. Margaret, a wealthy woman in her 50s, draped in a fur coat and dripping with diamonds, stood near a display of earrings. She frowned, her perfectly manicured brows knitting together, but she didn't say a word. She clutched her purse tighter, her lips pursed as if she wanted to intervene but thought better of it. Charles didn't notice or didn't care. His focus was locked on Patricia, who stood there, unflinching, her hands still folded in front of her floral dress. "I just want to see it," Patricia said, her voice as steady as ever, like she was asking for a glass of water instead of defending herself against a public attack. That did it. Charles's face twisted, his patience snapping like a brittle twig. He lunged forward and snatched the diamond necklace from her hands, his movements sharp and aggressive. "See it?" he shouted, holding the necklace up like it was evidence in a courtroom. "Who do you think you are? Touching something like this? Some broke old lady like you doesn't belong here. Don't you get that?" His voice rose with every word, venom spilling out unchecked. "This is Tiffany's, not a charity shop." The air in the store turned thick, almost suffocating. Customers shifted uncomfortably, some pretending to browse while others openly stared. Lydia, still lingering near the counter, bit her lip to hide a grin, egging Charles on with a subtle nod. A man in a pinstripe suit muttered something to his wife, who shook her head in disapproval but stayed silent. Margaret took a step back, her frown deepening, but she still didn't speak up. Charles didn't need an audience to keep going. He was on a roll now, his ego driving him like a runaway train. Patricia didn't move. She didn't flinch or raise her voice. She just looked at him, her gray eyes calm but piercing, like she could see right through his bluster. "I understand it's expensive," she said softly, "but I'd still like to try it on." Her words were simple, reasonable, but to Charles they were a slap in the face. "Try it on?" He couldn't believe it. He barked out a laugh, harsh and grating, and slammed the necklace back onto the velvet pad. "Try it on?" he repeated, his tone mocking her like she'd just asked to borrow his car. "Lady, you don't try on $50,000 jewelry unless you've got $50,000 to spend, and let's be real, you don't." He stepped closer, towering over her, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss. "I've seen people like you before. You wander in here, wasting my time, touching things you can't afford, thinking you're somebody. Well, newsflash. You're not. You're just a nobody in a cheap dress, and I'm done playing nice." He pointed toward the door, his finger trembling with barely contained rage. "Get out, now, or I'll have security drag you out, and trust me, they won't be gentle." The threat hung in the air, heavy and ugly. A few customers gasped, the sound sharp against the tense silence. Margaret finally spoke up, her voice shaky but firm. "That's enough," she said, clutching her purse like a shield. "You don't need to talk to her like that." Charles whipped around, his eyes narrowing. "Stay out of this," he snapped, brushing her off like she was nothing. "I'm doing my job, keeping this place exclusive. She doesn't belong here and you know it." Margaret opened her mouth to argue, then closed it, shrinking back under his glare. Patricia still didn't budge. She tilted her head slightly, that same faint smile flickering on her lips. "I'd rather not leave yet," she said, her voice so quiet it almost got lost in the growing buzz of the room. "I came here for a reason." Charles's face turned red, his hands balling into fists. "A reason," he roared, loud enough to make Lydia flinch. "The only reason you're here is to waste my time. You think you're special? You're nothing, just an old hag who can't even afford the dust on this counter." The store erupted into whispers, the tension now a living thing coiling around everyone. A young couple near the back exchanged wide-eyed looks, while an older man in a cashmere coat shook his head, muttering, "Unbelievable." Charles didn't care. He grabbed his phone from his pocket, his fingers shaking as he scrolled for security's number. "That's it," he said, his voice trembling with fury. "I'm done. You're out of here, one way or another." Patricia watched him, her expression unchanged, that calm smile still holding steady. She didn't argue, didn't plead. She just stood there, a quiet force against his storm. Charles dialed the number, barking into the phone. "Yeah, I need someone up here now. We've got a problem." He hung up, glaring at her with pure contempt. "You've got about 30 seconds before they toss you out on the street where you belong," he snarled. "Hope you enjoyed your little fantasy, because it's over." The whispers grew louder, the air crackling with anticipation. Margaret clutched her purse tighter, her eyes darting between Charles and Patricia. Lydia smirked, leaning against the counter like she was watching a show, and Patricia, she just waited, her hands still folded, her gaze locked on Charles like she knew something he didn't. The clock was ticking, and the whole store held its breath. The tension in Tiffany & Co. was about to snap when a low, guttural rumble cut through the air, the unmistakable sound of a motorcycle engine roaring to a stop outside. Heads turned, necks craned toward the glass doors. Charles, still clutching his phone mid-threat, froze, his finger hovering over the screen. Before anyone could process it, the doors buzzed open, and Keanu Reeves stepped inside. He was all leather and quiet intensity. A brown jacket hugged his broad shoulders, a helmet tucked under one arm. His boots hit the marble floor with a soft thud as he scanned the room. Then his eyes locked on Patricia, and his face softened. "Mom," he said, his voice warm but firm, carrying across the store like a lifeline. "Sorry I'm late." The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop, or a diamond for that matter. Charles's jaw slackened, his phone slipping slightly in his sweaty grip. His face drained of color so fast it was like someone had flipped a switch. "Mr. Reeves," he stammered, his voice cracking as he stumbled back a step. I didn't know." The words tumbled out, weak and desperate, a far cry from the venom he'd spat just moments ago. Lydia's smirk vanished, her eyes widening as she clutched the edge of the counter. Margaret, the wealthy customer, gasped audibly, her hand flying to her chest. The other customers exchanged stunned glances, the whispers replaced by a collective hush. Keanu didn't even glance at Charles at first. He crossed the room in a few long strides, his focus solely on Patricia. He set his helmet on the counter and pulled her into a gentle hug, his arms wrapping around her like a shield. "You okay, Mom?" he asked, low enough that only she, and maybe Charles, could hear. Patricia nodded, patting his arm with that same calm smile. "I'm fine, dear, just a little misunderstanding." But Keanu's jaw tightened as he pulled back, his gaze finally shifting to Charles, and when it did, the air turned heavy, like a storm rolling in. "You didn't know," Keanu said, his voice low but sharp, each word landing like a hammer. He stepped forward, closing the gap between him and Charles, who flinched but couldn't look away. "You didn't know a thing about my mom, but you decided she wasn't worth your time. You decided she didn't belong." His tone wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It cut deeper than any shout. "She designed costumes for some of the biggest films in Hollywood. She raised me on her own, taught me what dignity looks like, what respect means. And you?" He paused, letting the question hang. "You looked at her and saw nothing." Charles opened his mouth, his lips trembling as he tried to cobble together a defense. But she looked like..." He gestured vaguely at Patricia's floral dress, his hand shaking. "I was just protecting the store. I thought she couldn't... I didn't mean to..." His words tripped over each other, a jumbled mess of panic and excuses. Keanu shook his head, cutting him off with a look that could have stopped traffic. "Protecting the store?" he repeated, his voice steady but laced with disbelief. "From what? An old woman asking to see a necklace? Tell me, Charles." He glanced at the name tag pinned to the salesman's suit. "What exactly were you protecting? Your pride? Your ego?" Charles flinched again, his shoulders hunching like a kid caught red-handed. "I didn't know who she was," he blurted, his voice rising in desperation. If I'd known she was your mom, I'd never, I swear, I'd have treated her different." The admission spilled out before he could stop it, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Even Lydia winced, her knuckles white against the counter. Margaret muttered something under her breath, shaking her head in disgust. The older man in the cashmere coat stepped forward slightly, his expression hard. "That's the problem, isn't it?" he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You shouldn't need to know who she is to treat her like a person." Keanu's eyes flicked to the man, then back to Charles. "He's right," he said, his voice softening but no less firm. "You don't get a pass because you didn't know. You don't get to treat people like trash and call it protecting the store. What you were protecting was your own arrogance, and it's not worth half as much as you think." He took a step back, standing beside Patricia again, his presence a quiet wall between her and Charles. "You judged her by her clothes, her age, her shoes. You didn't see her. You didn't even try." Charles stood there, speechless, his chest heaving as sweat beaded on his forehead. His hands twitched at his sides like he wanted to disappear but didn't know how. The store was a sea of eyes now. Customers, Lydia, even the security guard who just walked in, pausing mid-step as he caught the tail end of Keanu's words. Patricia touched Keanu's arm lightly, her voice gentle. "It's all right, dear. He didn't mean any harm." But Keanu's expression didn't budge. "Maybe not," he said, his eyes still on Charles, "but he caused it anyway." The silence stretched, taut and electric. Charles looked like he might collapse under the weight of it, and then, from the back of the store, a new voice broke through. A deep, stern tone that promised consequences. "Bennett," it barked, "what the hell is going on here?" The stern voice belonged to Mr. Grayson, the store manager, a tall man in his late 50s, salt and pepper beard and a no-nonsense glare. He stormed out from the back office, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. His eyes swept the room, Keanu standing protectively beside Patricia. Charles shrinking under the weight of his own mess, and a dozen customers staring like they'd just witnessed a car crash. "Bennett," Grayson barked, his voice booming through the silence, "what the hell did you just do? You've turned this place into a damn circus." He jabbed a finger at Charles, who flinched like he'd been slapped. "You're done. I'm firing you right now. Pack your stuff and get out." Charles's head dropped, his shoulders trembling as the words hit him, his hands, still twitching from the confrontation, clenched into fists at his sides. He didn't look up, couldn't look up. The bravado he'd worn like armor was gone, stripped away in front of everyone. Sweat glistened on his forehead and his breath came in short, ragged bursts. The room watched, waiting for his next move, but he just stood there, a broken figure in an expensive suit. Lydia shifted uncomfortably behind the counter, her earlier amusement replaced by a flicker of guilt. Even the security guard, still hovering near the door, lowered his radio, unsure what to do. Then Patricia spoke. She raised a hand, her movement slow and deliberate, her voice cutting through the tension like a soft breeze. "Don't," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "Please, don't fire him." The words hung in the air, stunning everyone into silence. Grayson's mouth opened, then closed, his brow furrowing in confusion. Keanu turned to her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Mom?" he said, his voice low, questioning. Charles's head snapped up, his red-rimmed eyes wide with disbelief. "He was wrong," Patricia continued, looking at Grayson, then at Charles. "He made a terrible mistake, but everyone deserves a chance to fix what they've broken." The store erupted into a low murmur, customers exchanging incredulous looks. Margaret, the wealthy woman who'd spoken up earlier, stepped forward, her voice shaky. "You're serious? After what he said to you?" Patricia turned to her, that calm smile returning. "I am. I've seen people make worse mistakes and come back from them. He's young. He can learn." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that silenced the room again. Grayson crossed his arms, his stern expression softening just a fraction. "Mrs. Taylor, with all due respect, he humiliated you. Publicly. That's not something we can just brush off." Charles found his voice, though it cracked as he spoke. "I'm so sorry," he said, the words spilling out in a rush. He looked at Patricia, tears welling up and spilling down his cheeks. "I was an idiot, a complete jerk. I don't know why I said those things. I messed up so bad." He wiped his face with the back of his hand, his shoulders shaking harder now. "I didn't mean it, I swear I didn't." His voice broke and he buried his face in his hands. Sobbing openly, It wasn't the polished salesman crying, it was a man stripped bare, raw and vulnerable in a way no one expected. Lydia stepped out from behind the counter, her usual smirk nowhere to be found. She approached Patricia hesitantly, her hands clasped in front of her like a nervous kid. "Mrs. Taylor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry too." I laughed. I went along with it. I shouldn't have. You're amazing. Her eyes flicked to the floor, then back up, a mix of shame and admiration in them. Patricia nodded kindly. "Thank you," she said, her tone warm. "It's all right. We all have moments we're not proud of." Keanu watched the exchange, his jaw loosening as he took in his mother's grace. He gave her a small nod, a silent agreement, then turned to Grayson. "She's right," he said, his voice steady again. "If she's willing to give him a chance, maybe you should too." Grayson rubbed his chin, his eyes darting between Charles, still crying, and Patricia, the picture of composure. "This isn't how we do things here," he said, but his tone wavered, less certain now. He crossed a line, a big one. Keanu shrugged. "Lines get crossed, people get second chances. Up to you." Grayson sighed, a long, heavy sound that seemed to carry the weight of the day. "Fine," he said at last, pointing at Charles. "You're on thin ice, Bennett. One more screw-up and you're gone. You owe her everything." Charles nodded frantically, wiping his eyes again. "Thank you," he choked out, looking at Patricia. "Thank you so much." She smiled at him. Not a big smile, but enough to show she meant it. "Just do better," she said simply. Keanu picked up his helmet from the counter, glancing at his mom. "Ready to go, Mom?" he asked, his tone lighter now. She nodded, adjusting her purse on her shoulder. "Yes, dear? I think we're done here." They turned toward the door, Keanu's arm resting lightly on her back as they walked. The crowd parted silently, watching them go. Charles stood rooted to the spot, his hands still trembling, his face a mix of relief and shame. Lydia returned to the counter, her head down, avoiding the curious stares. Grayson disappeared back into his office, muttering something about paperwork. As the glass doors buzzed shut behind Keanu and Patricia, the store fell into a heavy quiet. The tension lingered, but it was different now. Less sharp, more reflective. Margaret approached the counter, setting her purse down. "That woman's a saint," she said to no one in particular. The older man in the cashmere coat nodded. "And he's damn lucky," he added, glancing at Charles. The salesman didn't respond. He just stared at the spot where Patricia had stood, the weight of her forgiveness pressing down on him like a debt he'd spend years repaying. A few blocks away from the chaos of Fifth Avenue, Patricia and Keanu settled into a small cafe tucked near Central Park. The place was cozy, with wooden tables and the faint hum of chatter mixing with the aroma of fresh coffee and warm pastries. They sat by a window, sunlight streaming in, casting a soft glow on Patricia's silver hair. She sipped her tea, a faint smile on her lips, while Keanu bit into a lemon scone, his posture relaxed for the first time all day. "And you didn't have to do that back there." "Mom," he said, brushing crumbs off his jacket, "letting him off the hook like that." Patricia set her cup down, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, I think I did. People need room to grow, dear, you know that." Keanu chuckled, shaking his head. "You're too good, you know. Always have been." She waved him off, but before she could reply, the cafe door swung open with a jingle. Both turned to look, and there stood Charles Bennett, still in his rumpled suit, his face flushed and uncertain. In his hands he clutched the diamond necklace from Tiffany's, the one Patricia had admired. He hesitated, then stepped forward, stopping a few feet from their table. "Mrs. Taylor," he said, his voice shaky but earnest. "Mr. Reeves, I hope I'm not intruding." Patricia tilted her head, surprised but not unwelcoming. "Charles?" she said, her tone gentle. Keanu raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair, but he didn't interrupt. Charles swallowed hard, holding up the necklace. "Mr. Grace," his words tumbling out, "he said it was okay, just this once. I wanted to give it to you, as an apology, for everything I said, everything I did. I was wrong, and I'm so sorry." His eyes darted to the floor, then back up, pleading for something he couldn't name. Patricia's smile widened, soft and genuine. She reached out, taking the necklace from his trembling hands. "Thank you, Charles," she said, her voice warm. "This is very kind of you. She gestured to the empty chair across from them. Why don't you sit with us? Charles blinked, caught off guard. Sit? I don't want to bother you, Keanu shrugged, a faint grin tugging at his lips. You're already here. Might as well. Charles hesitated, then slid into the seat, still clutching the edge of the table like he didn't quite belong. Patricia set the necklace beside her teacup, her fingers brushing the diamond lightly. You know, she said, looking at him, the real value isn't in this. It's beautiful, yes. Keanu leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Takes guts to show up like this, he said, his tone easy but approving. Charles managed a small, nervous laugh. Yeah, well, I figured I owed you both that much. Patricia chuckled, and soon all three were talking. Awkward at first, then lighter, the weight of the day melting away. Outside the sun dipped lower, its rays spilling through the window, wrapping them in a golden warmth. Laughter mingled with the clink of cups, a quiet testament to forgiveness, second chances, and the kind of humanity that shines brighter than any diamond ever could. This story teaches us that true worth lies not in wealth or status, but in how we treat others. Judgments can blind us, but kindness can heal. In life we'll meet people like Charles, quick to dismiss, and like Patricia, steady with grace. Choose her path. Offer second chances, see beyond the surface. It's a reminder to pause before we judge, to value humanity over pride. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Your support means everything. What's a time you've seen kindness change someone? Share below, hit like and subscribe for more stories that inspire us to be better.